Have you ever discovered something that completely changed how you viewed someone? Not something small or trivial, but a truth so profound, so fundamental, that suddenly every action of that person in the last few days or weeks takes on new meaning, new weight, a new dimension that you hadn't understood. Because that's exactly what happened to Emma Carson on a Thursday afternoon when she was just looking for a pen in Jake's room and ended up finding something much more significant: the complete truth about the price he was paying to keep her alive. Sometimes, you discover the truth by accident. Not through planned confession or dramatic revelation, but simply because a drawer locks strangely, and when you finally manage to open it with a stronger pull, there it is: documents that change everything. When Emma found those papers hidden in Jake's drawer, when she saw the official warning letters with Sheriff's Department letterhead, when she read the internal investigation reports against him written in cold, bureaucratic language that barely disguised the seriousness of the accusations, she finally understood the real price Jake Mercer was paying to keep her safe. 3 official letters stacked in chronological order, each more severe than the last. The first was a formal warning about unauthorized operations outside of established protocol. The second was an explicit threat of suspension for unauthorized use of departmental resources and possible falsification of official documents. The third, the most recent, dated just 5 days ago, was notification of a formal investigation that could result in dismissal or, in the document's exact words, possible criminal charges pending the conclusion of an internal investigation, to direct threats of suspension that Jake had apparently ignored completely, continuing to do exactly what he had been warned to stop. A formal investigation process underway that could end with Jake Mercer losing not only his badge, that piece of metal representing the entire identity he had built over years of dedicated service, but potentially his freedom if the prosecutor decided that certain actions constituted actual crimes. All because he had chosen to protect her his way, instead of the system's way. All because, when faced with a choice between following protocols he knew had failed before, or doing what he believed would truly keep Emma safe, he had chosen her, repeatedly, consciously, knowing exactly what the consequences would be. And he had never told her. He had never mentioned it during all those deep conversations they had had in recent weeks. During all those vulnerable confessions about fears and hopes. Never once had Jake said that every decision to keep her safe was costing him pieces of everything he had built. He had never let on that he was under investigation, that superiors were questioning his every move, that colleagues had filed formal complaints, that his entire career was hanging by an increasingly thin thread. Have you ever been through this? Ever discovered that someone was sacrificing far more than you realized? Carrying burdens they never mentioned because they didn't want you to feel guilty or indebted? Stick with me until the end, because what Emma discovered in those documents, and especially how Jake responded when she confronted him, would reveal exactly the kind of man he was, and exactly how much Emma had come to mean to him. Emma sat on the living room floor now, papers scattered around her like evidence of a crime, and in a way, that's exactly what they were: evidence of all the crimes and violations Jake had committed in the name of protecting her. Her hands trembled as she read each word, each formal accusation, each line that represented another piece of Jake's life being put at risk. There were notes in the margins of some documents in Jake's handwriting, defenses begun and abandoned, explanations he had clearly tried to formulate and then given up on. Emma recognized that firm but slightly irregular handwriting from the notes he left in the mornings when he went out early for perimeter checks. "I left at 5:30 a.m. Coffee is ready. I'll be back in 30 minutes. Doors are locked. You're safe." But these notes in the official documents were different. They were fragments of a man trying to defend himself, but realizing there was no real defense when you consciously chose to break rules you had sworn to follow. A protocol is inadequate when ... double quotes abandoned ... double quotes a previous witness was lost following official procedure ... double quotes scratched ... double quotes I don't regret the decisions I made, even though I acknowledge ... double quotes incomplete. Emma didn't know how long she'd been sitting there reading and rereading those documents when she heard the front door open. Jake was returning from the perimeter check he obsessively performed every few hours. That security ritual she'd found almost excessive, but now understood, stemmed from a much deeper place than simple professional caution. He stopped in the doorway, and Emma saw the exact moment her eyes registered the scene: her on the floor, surrounded by documents he had clearly tried to keep hidden, tears streaming down her face that she hadn't even realized she was crying. For 3 seconds that seemed like an eternity, no one moved. And then Jake closed the door behind him with deliberate care, took off his jacket, and hung it on the coat rack, as he always did, and entered the room as if he were approaching something fragile that could break with one wrong move. "Emma," he said. And just her name, just that word, spoken with that mixture of worry and resignation, was enough to make more tears stream down her face. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma asked, her voice broken, carrying the weight of all the emotions colliding within her: anger at being left in the dark, gratitude for the sacrifice he had made, overwhelming guilt for being the reason his life was falling apart, and something deeper that she couldn't name but that made her chest clench painfully. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to sit on the floor beside her, not in the armchair or on the sofa where he would have the advantage of height, but at the same level as her, surrounded by the same documents that revealed the full extent of her sacrifices. It was a small but significant gesture, and Emma perceived it even through the fog of emotions. "Because you would have tried to stop me," Jake finally said, his voice calm but carrying a truth he had clearly been holding back. "If I had shown you the first warning letter, you would have insisted on doing things officially. You would have said it wasn't worth risking my career." And Emma ... double quotes, he picked up one of the documents, the formal investigation notification, and looked at it with an expression somewhere between contempt and resignation. "You would be wrong. You are worth every risk, every line crossed, every consequence that comes. If something like this has ever happened to you, you've ever discovered that someone was sacrificing more than you knew, silently carrying burdens to protect you, making impossible choices without consulting you because they were afraid you would. Try to stop them. Share in the comments how you dealt with it." Because Emma was facing that moment now, that devastating realization that the man sitting next to her had literally risked everything, and she hadn't even realized it until now. "Jake, you could go to prison," Emma said, picking up the most recent letter and pointing to the legal language that spoke of possible criminal charges. "This isn't just about losing your job. They're talking about criminal prosecution. About you potentially being charged with crimes for things you did to protect me." "I know," Jake replied with that frustrating calm he used when he'd made a decision and saw no point in agonizing over it. "I've read the documents, Emma. I know exactly what I'm risking. And yet, if I could go back in time knowing everything I know now, I'd make every choice exactly the same way." Emma looked at him really, studying every detail of his face in the soft light of the room. She saw the lines of tension around his eyes that she had attributed solely to constant vigilance but now understood also stemmed from carrying this secret. She saw the way his jaw was tense, even as he tried to appear calm. She saw in his eyes that mixture of determination and something softer, more vulnerable, that made her heart race. "Why?" Emma whispered. "Why are you willing to risk so much? Your career, your reputation, your freedom, everything you've built over years of service. Why, Jake?" And if this part is resonating with you, if you're feeling the weight of this question, why someone would risk everything for another person, what it means when love becomes more important than self-protection, leave a like here so I know you're truly connected to this story. Because Jake's answer, what he was about to admit, would reveal the complete truth that had been behind every decision he had made. Jake took both of Emma's hands, and she felt them tremble slightly. Jake Mercer, the man who had faced armed men without blinking, was trembling. Because my greatest fear isn't losing my badge, he said, and each word seemed ripped from some deep place he rarely accessed. It's not facing investigation or suspension, or even criminal charges if it comes to that. Emma, my greatest fear, the nightmare that keeps me awake when I should be sleeping. That makes me check your room 5 times a night, even knowing your safety's losing you. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable in a way Jake rarely allowed. Emma felt the air leaving her lungs because she had suspected it, had seen the signs, but hearing him say it so directly was different. It's waking up one morning, Jake continued, his voice growing more intense, and discovering I arrived 3 minutes too late. That I made a tactical error that cost her life. That I trusted the wrong person, or followed the wrong protocol, or simply got unlucky, and you paid the ultimate price. Emma, I've carried Sarah Hollis's guilt for 6 years now. I know exactly what it's like to live with the weight of having failed to protect someone. And the idea of carrying that guilt with you, of having to live in a world where Emma Carson no longer exists, because I didn't do enough, double quotes. He stopped, swallowing with visible difficulty. This terrifies me in ways that combat never did. Because Sarah was a witness I swore to protect, and failing her destroyed me. But you, you've become so much more than that. You've become the person I think about when I wake up. The person whose perimeter I obsessively check, even though I know it's probably unnecessary. The person who reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving day after day. And if you want to follow the rest of this journey, if you want to see how Emma responds to this confession and what happens when they finally have to confront not only the external danger, but also the feelings that have grown between them, subscribe to the channel. Because this story is only beginning to reveal its deepest layers. Emma couldn't speak. She couldn't fully process what Jake had just admitted, not just that he cared, which she already knew, but the depth of that care. How fundamental it had become to him that risking everything seemed not only reasonable, but necessary. Jake, she finally managed to say, you can't put all of this on me. You can't make me the reason you destroy your entire life. I'm not destroying, Jake gently corrected her. I'm choosing. There's a difference. Destruction is passive. It's letting bad things happen without resistance. Choice is active. It's consciously deciding what matters most. And Emma, you matter most. More than a badge, more than a career, more than fear of consequences. He squeezed her hand. And before you say you didn't ask for this, that you don't want to be responsible for my choices, you're not responsible. These are my decisions, my choices, my consequences to bear. All I'm asking is that you let me continue making these choices. That you trust that I know what I'm risking, and that it's worth it. Emma looked at the documents scattered around them, each representing another piece of Jake's life being called into question. And then she looked back at the man who had done all this. Without hesitation, without regret, without even telling her, because he didn't want her to feel guilty. And something fundamental shifted within her at that moment. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because to truly understand the impact of that discovery, to comprehend exactly what those documents represented and why Emma was sitting on the floor, surrounded by them, with tears streaming down her face, you need to go back a few hours, to the exact moment where innocent ignorance transformed into devastating knowledge. And behind that accidental discovery lay a hidden truth that would fundamentally change how Emma viewed not only Jake, but the entire journey they had shared over the past few weeks. Emma wasn't searching. That was important to understand. She wasn't invading his privacy or distrusting him, or trying to uncover secrets. There was nothing sinister or suspicious about her intentions. She was simply looking for a pen in Jake's room while he was out doing that. 3 o'clock, perimeter check, he did religiously every day, rain or shine, tired or rested. She wanted to do the newspaper crossword puzzle, that simple pastime that had become an afternoon ritual for her during the weeks she'd been hiding there. The desk drawer had jammed strangely when she tried to open it, not locked with a key, just stuck, like old drawers sometimes do, when wood swells with moisture, or when something inside is positioned awkwardly. Emma had pulled gently once, then with a little more force, and on the third try, the drawer had finally given way with a creaking protest. And when he finally opened it with that stronger than necessary pull, the documents were there. Not intentionally hidden in a sealed folder or envelope marked confidential, but not exactly in plain sight either. They were at the bottom of the drawer under empty notepads and boxes of paper clips and all those things that accumulate in desk drawers over the years. As if Jake had put them there in a moment of frustration or worry and then simply kept piling things on top, leaving those problematic documents buried but not forgotten. The first thing Emma saw was the official letterhead, the county sheriff's department seal on letterhead that screamed authority and seriousness. And then the words, "Formal notice of protocol violation." Official letters that anyone with experience in professional settings would immediately recognize as the kind of document that goes in their permanent file. That is mentioned in performance reviews, that can be cited years later when promotions are denied or career decisions are questioned. Emma picked up the first document with hands that were already beginning to tremble and started to read. Formal warnings about inappropriate conduct in the performance of duties. Specific language about violations of established protocol and unauthorized use of departmental resources. An internal investigation. Report not just a warning or admonition, but a full formal investigation about improper relationship with a protected witness and unauthorized operations outside of official jurisdiction. Emma read each word with growing horror that began as stomach discomfort and quickly escalated into complete nausea. She read about how Jake's superiors had questioned his actions, specifically related to protecting her. About how colleagues, people who worked alongside him, who were supposedly part of the same team, had filed formal complaints describing Jake as having gone rogue and operating outside of proper supervision. She read about the formal investigation that had been opened 3 weeks ago, just when Jake had started protecting her more intensely. Emma realized with a pang in her heart. She read about the pending disciplinary process that could result in multiple consequences, escalating from formal reprimand to unpaid suspension to permanent dismissal if certain allegations were properly proven. And there were terrifying specifics in those documents that made everything more real, more concrete, more impossible to rationalize as bureaucratic overreach. Specific dates when Jake had supposedly used department computers for unauthorized research on members of the Castellano organization. Mileage records from official vehicles showing that he had driven far beyond his jurisdiction without approval. Transcripts of conversations where Jake had apparently lied to superiors about where he was and what he was doing during his official vacation. Each line was further evidence that Jake had systematically violated policies and procedures, not through carelessness or ignorance, but deliberately, consciously, repeatedly, and it all traced back to her. To Emma, every violation listed was directly connected to his efforts to keep her safe in ways that went beyond what the department would authorize or approve. And beneath all that official documentation, hidden between the pages like secret confessions, were notes in Jake's handwriting. Emma recognized that handwriting immediately. She'd seen it in the notes he left in the mornings, in the shopping lists he made, in the reminders he wrote to himself. But these notes were different. They were fragments of defenses he'd started writing and then abandoned. As if he'd decided halfway through that it wasn't worth defending himself, when he knew he'd make the exact same choices again. Protocol is inadequate when a witness's life is at immediate stake, and official channels, double quotes, abandoned mid-sentence, crossed out with a single line that suggested frustration rather than a change of mind. A previous witness was lost following official procedure that failed to recognize, double quotes, also incomplete. As if Jake had started to argue his case, but then realized that invoking Sarah Hollis would only complicate things or make everything too personal. I don't regret the decisions made, even though I recognize they violated departmental policy, because double quotes, this had been started and stopped 3 different times. Emma could see where Jake had tried to find the right words, crossed them out, tried again, and finally given up completely. There was also a calendar at the bottom of the pile of documents, where Jake had marked dates not with extensive details, but with critical notes that told a story of their own. Red circles around dates of disciplinary hearings, asterisks marking deadlines for written responses to allegations, and on a date 3 weeks in the future, written in more careful handwriting as if importance demanded extra clarity. Final hearing status decision. Emma was holding the calendar when she realized that date, that final hearing that would determine Jake's fate in the department, was scheduled to take place in the middle of a period when he had promised her he would be focused on building a case against Castellano. Jake had known throughout that conversation about extended protection, about waiting for the FBI to build a solid case, that his own career was literally counting down the days until the final trial, and he had never mentioned it. He had never let it show during conversations about future plans that his own future was as uncertain as hers. He had let Emma make plans, express hopes, imagine scenarios where they would have time to discover what was growing between them all, while knowing that in 3 weeks, he might no longer have his badge, he might be facing criminal charges, he might be dealing with consequences so severe that any future they had imagined would become impossible. Emma didn't realize she was crying until a tear fell on the calendar, smudging the blue ink from Jake's notation. That was what finally broke the dam, completely seeing that physical evidence of how she was affecting even the documents that revealed his sacrifice. How her emotions were literally marking the evidence of how much he had risked. Comment below. He hid everything to protect her from blame. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because that moment when Jake returned home and found Emma surrounded by the truth he had tried to hide wasn't just about confrontation or revelation. It was about the fundamental transformation that happens when 2 people stop protecting each other through omissions and finally decide to face the full reality together, no matter how difficult it may be. And the impact of that conversation would reveal layers of decisions and sacrifices that went far beyond what those documents suggested. Jake returned home exactly 23 minutes later. Emma looked at the clock when she heard the key in the lock. That sound that had become so familiar in recent weeks. 23 minutes she had spent sitting at the kitchen table after taking all those documents from the living room, spreading them out methodically like evidence in a trial. Tears silently streaming down her face as she reread specific passages, trying to fully comprehend the extent of what Jake had risked. When the door opened and Jake entered, Emma didn't turn around immediately. She just kept staring at the document in front of her, that formal investigation report with its specific allegations and cold legal language. But she heard Jake stop in the kitchen doorway, heard his breathing change slightly as he took in the scene. For a moment that seemed to stretch far beyond its actual duration, neither of them moved. Emma could feel his eyes on her, could imagine exactly what he was seeing, her surrounded by all the secrets he had kept, physical evidence of sacrifices he had never intended for her to discover. And then, through her tear-stained vision, Emma saw multiple emotions passing across his face, reflected in the kitchen window pane. First came surprise, not dramatic shock, but that sudden realization that something you'd sort of expected had finally happened. Then came something that felt dangerously close to relief, as if Jake had been carrying those secrets for so long that part of him was genuinely grateful not to have to anymore. And above all, permeating everything, there was resignation, not defeat, but calm acceptance, as if he had always known that Emma would eventually find out and had made peace with that inevitability. "Why didn't you tell me?" Emma finally asked, her voice broken and hoarse from crying. She still couldn't look directly at him, so she continued focusing on the scattered documents. "Jake, you're under formal investigation. You could lose your badge that I know means everything to you, because you told me about earning it, about what it represents. You could be criminally charged with some of these things: unauthorized use of resources, falsification of official documents, obstruction of justice, if the prosecutor wants to argue that way. Emma finally turned to look at him, and the sight of him standing there in the doorway, still wearing mud-stained boots from the perimeter check, his hair tousled by the wind, that expression of calm resignation that broke her heart, brought new tears to her eyes. And you just never mentioned it. Never said a word during all those conversations we had, during all those moments where we talked about the future and plans and what would happen when all this was over. Jake closed the door behind him with deliberate care, the same meticulous care. Emma had seen him apply to everything, from checking locks to making coffee. He took off his jacket slowly, hung it on the coat rack, as he always did, and then walked to the table and sat in the chair opposite Emma, not beside her, where it would have been more comforting, but across from her, where they could look directly at each other, where there was no way to avoid the full weight of the conversation they needed to have. When he spoke, his voice was calm, that frustrating calm he used when he had fully processed something and reached conclusions he saw no point in questioning, but it carried a weight of truth that he had been carrying alone for weeks. "Because you would have tried to stop me," Jake said, and there was no accusation in his words, just a simple statement of fact. "If I had shown you that first warning letter when I received it 3 weeks ago, if I had told you that superiors were questioning my actions, you would have immediately insisted on doing everything the official way. You would have said it wasn't worth risking my career. You probably would have even offered to go into standard witness protection just to take the pressure off me." He picked up one of the documents, that more severe investigation report, and looked at it with an expression somewhere between contempt and pragmatic recognition. "And Emma, if I had told you about the formal investigation, about the specific allegations, about the fact that colleagues were actively working against me by filing complaints, you would have felt guilty. You would have carried that weight as if it were your responsibility, that I was facing consequences for choices I made." Jake put the document back and looked directly at Emma. "And I didn't want you to carry that weight. I didn't want every moment of relative safety we managed to build here to be tainted by guilt about what it was costing me. I didn't want you spending sleepless nights worrying about my career when you should finally be able to sleep without jumping at every noise." Emma shook her head, frustration mingling with all the other emotions. "But Jake, this wasn't a decision you had to make alone. You included me in decisions about my own safety. You treated me as a partner, not as a passive victim who needs to be protected from hard truths. But in this thing that affects you so fundamentally, that could literally destroy everything you've built, you left me completely in the dark." She picked up the calendar with that date marked, 3 weeks in the future. "You have a final hearing scheduled. A hearing that will decide whether you keep your badge or lose everything. And you never mentioned it. You let me make plans, talk about the future, imagine scenarios where we would have time to figure out what's happening between us all, while knowing that in 3 weeks, you could be facing unemployment or criminal charges." Her voice broke completely now. "How could you leave me in the dark about something so important? How could you carry this burden alone when I was right here, when I could have, I don't know, done something, helped in some way?" Jake remained quiet for a long moment, and Emma saw a struggle unfolding behind his eyes, that tension between maintaining the protective walls he had built over the years and being completely honest, even if that honesty left him vulnerable in ways he hated. "Because there was nothing you could do," he finally said, and there was weariness in his voice that Emma rarely heard. "Emma, these investigations, these allegations, they're based on actions I actually took. I can't deny that I used departmental resources without authorization, because that's exactly what I did when I tracked down members of the Castellano organization through official databases. I can't deny that I operated out of jurisdiction, because I literally drove to 3 different states following leads. I can't deny that I lied in reports, because those reports are filed with my signature on lies I told, to cover up what I was really doing. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. So, what could you have done? Convinced me not to do those things. Emma, you were in real danger. You were being actively hunted by people with the resources and motivation to eliminate you. And I had a choice: follow protocols that I knew had failed before, and pray that this time would be different. Or do what I believed would truly keep you alive, even knowing there would be consequences. And you chose me, Emma said softly, finally understanding completely. I chose you, Jake confirmed without hesitation, every time, every decision, every line crossed. And Emma, I would do it again, even knowing exactly how it ended. Even seeing these documents, and knowing that the final hearing is coming, and that there's a real chance of losing everything, I would make every choice exactly the same way. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because that confession, I chose you, every time, every decision, opened the floodgates to even more devastating revelations. And in the hours that followed that initial moment at the kitchen table, as Emma pressed for complete answers, and Jake finally stopped shielding her from the full truth, the true extent of his sacrifice unfolded in layers that were far worse than those official documents suggested. And each new revelation from behind the scenes of his actions showed not only how much he had risked, but how methodically he had violated virtually every protocol and law he was supposed to be upholding. They had moved from the kitchen to the living room for the past 2 hours. Forgotten coffee, cooling in mugs neither of them had touched. The sun setting through the window, while Jake systematically dismantled any illusion that his actions had been merely minor technicalities or relatively benign protocol violations. Emma had insisted on knowing everything, every detail, every decision, every line crossed, and Jake, after initially resisting, had finally yielded to that demand. Department resources, Jake began, picking up one of the documents and pointing to a specific section on misappropriation of official property. I used work computers to access criminal databases that I should technically only have been accessing for officially authorized investigations. I ran license plate numbers, checked the histories of people associated with Castellano, tracked movement patterns through traffic cameras, all without having an official case open or proper supervision. Emma felt her stomach tighten. This is ... misappropriation, Jake confirmed. Technically, unauthorized use of government resources for purposes that were not part of my official duties. And Emma, it wasn't just once or twice. It was dozens of inquiries over 3 weeks. Computer logs show exactly how many times I accessed those systems, and when. There's a digital record of everything, he continued before Emma could respond. And it wasn't just computers. I took surveillance equipment from the evidence room cameras, listening devices, GPS, trackers, all officially registered for other cases, but which I was using to monitor people associated with the Castellano organization. Technically theft, potentially the crime of misappropriation of government property. Emma was having trouble processing the scale of it. Jake, are you saying you actually stole equipment from the department? I lent it without authorization, Jake corrected, but the bitter smile suggested he understood the legal distinction was minimal. And I eventually returned everything. But yes, for a period of 2 weeks, I had equipment that was officially registered for other cases, but that I was actually using to track threats against you. If anyone wanted to make a criminal argument, there's grounds for charges. But that was only the beginning, Emma discovered with growing horror. Jake had lied in official reports, not minor omissions, but outright fabrications about where he was and what he was doing during his officially recorded vacation. He had created false alibis, had told superiors he was dealing with family matters in Arizona, when in reality, he was in a cheap motel 30 kilometers away. Essentially operating unauthorized private protection. Falsification of official documents, Jake said, and there was resignation in his voice. These time and activity reports I submitted have my signature on information I know to be false. There's no arguing it was a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were deliberate lies created to cover up what I was really doing. Emma picked up one of the reports Jake had pulled from another folder, one she hadn't seen in the original drawer. She saw the typed entries: 10/14, Arizona. Visiting family days dividido por 15 menos Arizona. Dealing with personal matters days dividido por 16 menos Arizona. Return delayed due to family complications. All lies, Emma now knew. Jake had been at Willow Ridge that entire weekend, had been sleeping in a parked personal vehicle where he could observe her apartment, had been tracking men who were following her. That's a crime, Emma said, not as a question but as a devastating realization. Jake, falsifying official documents is a real crime with real consequences. It could be charged as a crime, yes, Jake admitted. Depending on how aggressive a prosecutor you want to be, you could argue that it constitutes fraud against the government or falsification of official records. It probably wouldn't lead to severe prison time if convicted, but it could definitely result in formal criminal charges. And there was more. Jake had made unauthorized contact with witnesses and federal investigators through Rebecca, his friend at the FBI. He had shared local case information with federal agents without going through proper channels or obtaining necessary approvals. He had crossed jurisdictional lines in ways that violated multiple protocols regarding cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Technically, it's interference in a federal investigation, Jake explained, showing Emma emails exchanged with Rebecca that clearly showed him passing on information he wasn't authorized to share. And depending on how you interpret certain actions, especially where I followed people Rebecca was monitoring or where my actions potentially alerted targets to federal surveillance, it could be argued as obstruction of justice. Emma felt as if she were being slowly drowned in an ever-deepening understanding of the hole Jake had dug for himself. Obstruction of justice, she repeated, her voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. Jake, this is ... This could lead to federal prison. Real prison, not just losing your job. If someone decides to tighten the screws. Jake admitted, and there was an almost frightening calm in his voice, as if he had made complete peace with that possibility. If a federal prosecutor decides that my actions compromised their investigation, or if Castellano's lawyers argue that I was a corrupt police officer with a personal vendetta and managed to create enough doubt. Yes, there is a scenario where I face federal charges that could result in prison time. Emma could no longer sit still. She stood up and began pacing the room, nervous energy needing a physical outlet because her body no longer knew what to do with all the emotions colliding within her. Horror at the extent of what Jake had risked. Overwhelming guilt because it was all for her. Anger because he had made all these decisions without consulting her. And underlying it all, that growing love that made everything even more painful, because now she understood exactly how much he had put on the line. You could go to prison, Emma finally said aloud, letting the full horror of that possibility sink in completely. Jake, are you telling me that you could actually, genuinely face criminal charges for all of this? That there's a real chance you could not only lose your badge and career, but go to federal prison? There's a chance, Jake confirmed, and Emma saw something in his eyes that made her stop walking. It wasn't fear of the potential consequences, but something more complex, determination, mixed with the peace that came from knowing he had made the right choices, even if they came at a terrible price. But Emma, I would do it all again, he said, rising to meet her in the middle of the room. Every decision, every line crossed, every risk I took, and the consequences I now face. Because the alternative was trusting the system that failed Sarah Hollis, that left her dead on her doorstep 3 days after promising protection. And I won't let that happen to you. Comment below. He literally risked his freedom. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because Jake's confession, I would do it all again, triggered a transformation in Emma that went beyond simple gratitude or even love. It unleashed real, justified anger that had been building as she processed each new revelation, and the internal conflict that exploded in that moment in the room revealed a hidden truth about relationships built in extreme circumstances, that protection without consent, no matter how well-intentioned, can feel as much like love as it does like control, and that Emma needed to establish where that line lay before they could move forward. Emma had stopped walking when Jake said that I would do it all again, and for a moment she just stood there processing it. Then something inside her broke, not dramatically or explosively, but like a dam finally giving way under accumulated pressure. She turned to look at him, and Jake must have seen something changing in her expression because he tensed slightly, bracing himself. "You should have told me," Emma said, and now there was anger mixed with all the anguish and gratitude and confused love. Not screaming, not hysterical, but that cold, articulate anger that was somehow more powerful for being so controlled. "Jake, I had a right to know that my decisions, my choices about where to stay, how long to remain here, whether to accept your protection were costing you your entire career. That every day I spend in this house is another day of evidence against you in an investigation that could literally destroy everything you've built." She started walking again, unable to stand still as nervous energy coursed through her, searching for an outlet. Her steps were quick, agitated, her hands gesturing as she spoke, because her body needed to express what words alone could not. "You involved me in decisions about my own safety from the very beginning," Emma continued, turning to look at him, her eyes still wet with tears but also shining with intense emotion. "When you planned to use me as bait for Castellano, you consulted me. When you decided to bring me into your home, you explained the reasoning and gave me a choice. When you taught me how to use a weapon, you treated me like an adult capable of making informed decisions. You treated me as a partner, not as a passive victim who needed to be protected from difficult truths or complicated realities." Emma stopped in front of him now, closing the distance so that he had to look directly at her, had to see the anger and hurt and confusion battling on her face. "But in this sin, this thing that affects you so fundamentally, that it could cost you not only your career, but your freedom, you left me completely in the dark. Why, Jake? Why did you think you had the right to decide alone how much of your future you were willing to sacrifice? Why was this decision different from all the others we made together?" It was a fair argument, profoundly fair, and Jake knew it. Emma saw immediate recognition of that truth in his face, saw the way his jaw tightened, how his eyes darted slightly before forcing eye contact, how his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, suddenly clenched into involuntary fists. He knew she was right. He knew he had been hypocritical in a way, preaching partnership while keeping massive secrets. But Emma also saw something deeper in his expressions, something he was clearly struggling to verbalize, searching for the right words to explain a decision he perhaps didn't fully understand himself. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that Emma rarely heard from him. "Because I was afraid," Jake admitted, and those 3 words, coming from a man who had faced combat and armed criminals without blinking, carried enormous weight. Not of consequences for me, not of investigation or suspension, or even criminal charges, but fear that if you knew the real price, you would make a different choice, that you would insist on official protection, or enter a witness protection program, or even give up, testifying altogether to take the target off your back. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them even further. "And Emma, selfishly, I couldn't let you make those choices, because they would all mean I wouldn't be here, protecting you personally anymore. They would mean entrusting your safety to other people, 2 systems I know have flaws, 2 protocols I've witnessed fail. And the idea of not being here, of not being me between you and any danger that might come, ... double quotes, Jake stopped, swallowing hard. That terrified me more than any professional consequence. So yes, I hid the extent of what I was risking. Not to protect you from blame, although that was part of it, but mainly to protect my ability to continue being the one who kept you safe." Emma felt a slight hint of anger creeping in at that raw honesty. but she forced herself to hold back because this was too important to let his vulnerability soften. "Don't you see the problem with that?" she asked. "Jake, you're describing control, not protection control. You made a unilateral decision about how much of your future to sacrifice specifically to ensure I had no choice about how to protect myself." She saw those words hit him like a physical blow. A painful acknowledgement that there was truth there that he hadn't fully considered. And Emma pressed on, because this needed to be said, needed to be confronted now, before patterns were established that couldn't be undone. "I understand instinct," Emma continued, her voice growing softer but no less intense. "I understand fear, and I even understand the selfishness of wanting to be you, specifically protecting me. But Jake, a relationship, any kind of real, healthy relationship, cannot be built on one partner making massive unilateral decisions about their own well-being to control the other partner's choices." She took both of his hands, holding them firmly. "You say you treat me like a partner, but partners have complete information. Partners make choices knowing the real costs. You gave me the illusion of partnership while controlling things behind the scenes to ensure my choices led only to the results you wanted." Jake remained silent for a long moment, and Emma could see the processing happening. She could see him struggling with that characterization because it went against how he viewed his own actions. But she also couldn't completely deny the truth in it. When he finally spoke, there was something like defeat in his voice, but also the beginning of real understanding. "You're right," he said simply. "Emma, you're right. I didn't think about it in those terms. In my mind, I was just protecting you, doing what was necessary to keep you alive. But you're right that by withholding information, by making decisions without consulting you about their impact on me, I was essentially controlling your options." He squeezed her hands. "And I have no good defense for this except that when it comes to you, when I think about something happening to you, rationality goes out the window. All that professional calm, all that ability to weigh options objectively disappears, and I'm left only with a primal fear of losing you." Emma saw tears welling up in the corners of his eyes now, something she had only seen once before. "But that doesn't make it right," Jake continued. "It doesn't justify taking away your choices or hiding truths you had a right to know. Emma, I'm sorry. I'm genuinely sorry for treating you like something fragile that needed to be protected even from information. When I know that you're stronger than that. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because Jake's apology, that genuine acknowledgement that he had erred in controlling her choices through omission, opened the door to something even deeper, even more vulnerable. And what happened in the following minutes revealed the hidden truth that lay behind every decision Jake made. Every risk he took, every line he crossed. It wasn't just about protecting a witness or redeeming past mistakes. It was about love so deep, so consuming, that it frightened even the man who felt it. Jake stood up to when he saw that Emma had stopped pacing, had stopped letting anger propel her across the room. He closed some of the distance between them, but carefully respected the space Emma clearly still needed, not invading, not forcing closeness, just offering presence. And when he spoke, each word seemed to be ripped from some deep place he rarely accessed, costing him something precious he normally fiercely guarded. "Because my biggest fear isn't losing my badge," Jake said, his voice low, but loaded with an intensity that cut through any lingering anger in Emma and brought her to a complete standstill. "It's not facing an investigation or formal charges, or losing a career I've spent years building. It's not even going to prison if it comes to that. If the prosecutor decides to crack down and make an example of me." He paused, and Emma saw his throat move as he swallowed with difficulty. "Emma, my greatest fear, the nightmare that keeps me awake at 3 a.m. when I should be sleeping, that makes me check your room 5, 6, 7 times a night, even though I know rationally that you're safe, is losing you." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and exposed, and Emma felt something fundamentally shifting in the atmosphere of the room. This was no longer about arguments or who was right or wrong. This was Jake, finally, completely opening up about the truth that had been driving everything. It's waking up one morning and realizing I arrived too late, Jake continued, taking another cautious step toward her, and Emma saw a raw vulnerability in his face that she rarely saw, that expression he normally hid beneath layers of professional competence and controlled calm. It's getting a call saying something happened while I was checking a different lead, or relying on the wrong protocol, or simply not being there in the moment that mattered. His voice grew more tense, more burdened. It's imagining arriving and finding ... and having to live with the knowledge that I made a tactical error that cost you your life, that I trusted the wrong person, that I followed a procedure with a flaw I didn't foresee, that I was simply unlucky and you paid the ultimate price for my decisions. Emma felt the air literally leave her lungs as she processed it. She'd known Jake cared, she'd seen evidence of it every day in the small and large ways he showed it. In the coffee he made exactly how she liked it, in the obsessive perimeter checks, in the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't noticing, with that mixture of protectiveness and something deeper. But hearing him say it so directly, with such raw and unguarded honesty, was different. It was transformative. It was the kind of confession that fundamentally changed the terrain of the relationship, because it left no room for ambiguity or doubt about the depth of his feelings. Jake, Emma began, needing to say something, needing to acknowledge what he had just shared. But he continued as if now that he had started, he needed to finish. Needed to get it all out while he still had the courage. Emma, I've been carrying the guilt of Sarah Hollis for 6 years now, he said. And there was an old pain in those words she'd heard before, but which now resonated differently, in the context of this broader confession. I know exactly what it's like to live with the weight of having failed to protect someone who trusted you. I know what it's like to wake up every morning and remember that if you had done one thing differently, made even a marginally better decision, that person would still be alive. He was right in front of her now, and Emma could see every detail of his face, the lines of tension, the moisture in the corners of his eyes, the way his lips trembled slightly as he struggled to maintain his composure. And the idea of carrying this guilt with you, of having to live in a world where Emma Carson no longer exists, because I didn't do enough, or didn't risk enough, or didn't protect her properly, ... Double quotes, Jake stopped. And Emma saw a tear finally escape and run down his face. This terrifies me in ways that combat never did. Because Sarah was a witness I swore to protect, and failing her destroyed me in ways I'm still dealing with. But you've become so much more than that. So much more than a witness or a case or even a friend. He took her hands, the same gesture Emma had made moments before, but now carrying a different weight. You've become the person I think about when I wake up. Not a fleeting thought, but the first real thought, even before I'm fully conscious. The person I obsessively check on, not because protocol dictates it, but because I can't help but check. I can't relax until I physically confirm that you're okay. His voice broke slightly. You became the person who reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving day after day carrying old guilt. Who made me feel something beyond responsibility and duty. Who made me want a future instead of just tolerating the present. Emma was crying now too. Tears streaming freely as Jake continued that confession that was completely reshaping her understanding of his motives. So yes, I hid the extent of what I was risking, Jake admitted, echoing what he had said before, but now with full context. Because if you had known if you had truly understood that each day here was costing me pieces of my career, that the investigation was deepening, that there was a real chance of criminal charge, you might have insisted on doing things differently. He shook her hand. She could have chosen official protection through appropriate channels. She could have entered a witness protection program where she would be relocated and I would never know where she was. She could even have given up testifying altogether. Refused to cooperate with the investigation to take the target off her back. Jake paused, taking a deep breath. And Emma, selfishly, completely, consciously selfishly, I couldn't let you make those choices, because they would all mean I wouldn't be here protecting you personally anymore. They would mean entrusting your safety to other people, to systems I know have failed, to protocols I've witnessed being inadequate when it matters. He brought her hands to his chest, pressing them against where his heart beat rapidly. And the idea of losing you, whether to physical danger because I wasn't there to prevent it, or simply to distance and separation when you no longer needed me, and realized there was no reason to stay, that terrifies me in ways that combat never has, in ways that death never has. Emma could feel his heart beat through her hands, could feel how fast it was beating despite the outward calm he tried to project. And suddenly all the anger she had been harboring, all the justified indignation over choices made without her consent, crumbled before the stark reality of that vulnerability. Comment below. That's his deepest fear. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Jake's confession, that raw acknowledgement that the terror of losing her outweighed any other fear, fundamentally changed the dynamic of the conversation. And what Emma did in response, the decision she made at that moment about how to proceed, would reveal not only her own transformation throughout this journey, but also establish the kind of partnership they could have from then on. Because love without complete honesty was just another form of loneliness, and Emma was determined to ensure that they didn't build their relationship on a foundation of partial truths. Emma moved even closer to him, closing the last few inches of distance Jake had respectfully maintained, and took both of his hands firmly in a way that conveyed determination rather than mere comfort. When she spoke, her voice was calm but carried an authority that would not tolerate evasions or gentle protectiveness. "Tell me everything," she said, looking directly into his eyes so he couldn't look away. "No hiding, no protecting me from hard truths, no unilaterally deciding which pieces of information I can or cannot handle. What exactly are the specific threats you're facing? Not generalities about the investigation or possible consequences. Specifics, names of who is investigating you, the exact nature of the allegations, the real probabilities of each potential outcome." Jake hesitated, and Emma could see that protective instinct struggling within him, that urge to soften the truth, to present an edited version that would be less frightening, to continue carrying the heavier burden alone. But Emma squeezed his hands tightly enough to be almost painful, anchoring him in the present moment and in her demand for complete transparency. "Partners, remember?" Emma said, echoing a word Jake had used weeks ago when he first brought her home. "You said we were partners. You promised you'd treat me as an equal, not as a fragile victim. So you treat me like one now. You give me respect and full information, even if it's hard to hear." Jake nodded slowly, and Emma saw resolve solidifying on his face, resolution to finally, completely, stop filtering the truth. When he began to speak, he didn't soften anything, and Emma appreciated that, even though what he said made her stomach churn with renewed anxiety. "There's a formal departmental investigation being conducted by Captain Morrison," Jake began, and Emma listened as he insisted on precision in every detail rather than comfortable vagueness. "Morrison is a 25-year veteran, has played by the rules his entire life, and has zero tolerance for what he sees as officers going rogue. He told me personally 2 weeks ago that he considers my actions a betrayal of public trust, and that he will recommend dismissal regardless of other outcomes." Emma first felt a real tremor of fear about specific consequences rather than abstract ones. Dismissal, not suspension, but permanent dismissal. "Yes, Jake." Confirmed. "And termination for misconduct means it wouldn't just be losing this job. It would essentially mean being blacklisted for any future law enforcement positions. No department would hire me with a termination for misconduct on record. It would mean the end of a career I started at 22, and that has literally been my entire identity for 14 years. He continued before Emma could fully process it. "Beyond the departmental investigation, there's a real possibility of suspension. During the investigation, if investigators conclude that my active presence would compromise the integrity of the force, suspension without pay, meaning no income, while the process unfolds. And Emma, these processes can take months, potentially half a year or more if lawyers get involved. Emma quickly did some mental calculations. Half a year without income, facing potential legal costs, possibly losing her house if she couldn't pay the mortgage. Jake, he'd be financially ruined. Potentially, he admitted with the brutal honesty she'd asked for. I have some savings, but not enough to cover 6 months without income plus legal costs, if that comes to that. So yes, there's a scenario where I lose not only my career, but also my financial stability. But it didn't stop there. Jake explained that in addition to departmental consequences, there were talks, still preliminary, but increasingly serious, about potential criminal charges. The county prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Chen, who had a reputation for being aggressively tough on police corruption, had apparently expressed interest in reviewing his case. Chen sees cases of police misconduct as opportunities to make examples, Jake explained, and there was tension in his jaw as he spoke about it. If she decides that certain actions, especially unauthorized use of department resources, falsification of official documents, potential interference in a federal investigation, constitute crimes that deserve prosecution, she's going to tighten the screws. She won't accept a plea deal. She'll want a full trial and conviction on record. And besides, Jake said, his voice growing more tense in a way Emma rarely heard, there's political pressure that's complicating everything. Victor Castellano has connections, real connections with people in positions of power. His lawyers are already making public noise about harassment, about a corrupt sheriff with a personal vendetta operating outside the law. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. They're trying to turn this against you. Exactly, Jake confirmed. Their defense strategy is not just to deny Castellano's guilt, but to attack the credibility of those accusing him. And I became the perfect target. An officer with an active investigation against him, who admittedly violated protocols, who has a personal connection with a key witness that makes objectivity questionable. He paused, and what he said next was clearly the most difficult part. If Castellano's lawyers are good enough, and they are very, very good, they can raise reasonable doubt about processes and protocols. They can argue that evidence was tainted by a corrupt official with questionable motives. They can suggest that I planted evidence or coerced witnesses or manipulated the investigation to serve a personal agenda. So, by risking everything, you could actually help Castellano escape? Emma asked, and there was genuine horror in the question, because it would mean that Jake's sacrifice would not only cost him everything, but potentially allow that dangerous man to evade justice. Potentially, Jake admitted, and Emma saw how that possibility tormented him. If his lawyers are good enough to create reasonable doubt about trial procedures and protocols, it's a dangerous game, Emma. I risk my career and freedom to protect you in ways that could ironically undermine a case that would put Castellano in prison permanently. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because that revelation that Jake's sacrifices could ironically help Castellano escape justice created an impossible dilemma that completely transformed how Emma viewed the entire situation. And what happened in the following minutes, the decisions Emma made and the firmness with which she declared them, would reveal her own transformation from a frightened witness needing protection to an equal partner determined to fight not only for her own safety, but for that of the man who had risked everything for her. Emma deliberately let go of Jake's hands and stepped back, creating the physical distance she clearly needed to think without the influence of his proximity, without that magnetic pull that made it difficult to focus logically when he was around. She walked to the kitchen window, that same window that had become familiar in recent weeks, and stood there looking out at the backyard where Jake performed those obsessive perimeter checks. Every day, a ritual she now understood stemmed from a much deeper place than simple professional caution. For several long minutes, she just stood there, her back to Jake, and he silently respected that space. Emma could feel his eyes on her. She could imagine how tense he probably was, waiting to see how she would process all those devastating revelations. But he didn't speak, didn't pressure her, just let her have the time she needed. Emma was doing mental calculations, processing probabilities and risks and consequences, in ways she never had to before. She was weighing what Jake had risked against what he could lose. She was considering the implications of every possible choice, hers, his, theirs, together. And slowly, through that fog of conflicting emotions and multiple fears, a clarity began to emerge. A resolution that seemed simultaneously terrifying and absolutely necessary. When she finally turned to look at Jake again, there was something different in her face, a determination he hadn't seen before. A firmness that went beyond simply surviving or being protected. It was the expression of someone who had made a difficult decision and was fully committed to it regardless of the consequences. "I will testify," Emma said, her voice strong and clear, without any tremor of uncertainty or fear. "Officially, publicly, in open court if necessary. I will give full testimony about everything I saw that night in the alley, about the transaction I witnessed, about the identities of everyone involved, that I was able to see clearly." Jake began to speak, probably to protest, to argue that this would put her in even more danger, to offer alternatives, but Emma raised her hand in a gesture that refused interruption. "No," she said firmly. "Now I'm the one making the decisions. You risked everything for me without consulting me, making unilateral choices about your own future to protect me. Now I'm going to do the same. I'm going to make choices that you probably wouldn't approve of, that will worry you, that will go against every protective instinct you have. And you're going to have to accept it because that's what partners do. They trust each other to make difficult decisions even when they're scary." Emma stepped toward him, and there was a burning intensity in her eyes. "And I will make it absolutely clear during my testimony and in any subsequent interviews that any unofficial protection I received was because the official system had completely failed. I will explain that I was repeatedly threatened, that I reported those threats through appropriate channels, that I received empty reassurances about extra patrols that were obviously inadequate," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she articulated the plan that had been forming. "I will testify that when you intervened in unauthorized ways, it was because you were trying to correct a systemic flaw that had left a witness vulnerable. I will be a character witness for you if formal charges are brought, or I will sit in that courtroom or that disciplinary hearing and explain exactly why you did what you did and why I am alive today because you chose to protect a witness instead of protecting your career." Jake was shaking his head now, and Emma could see worry and fear battling on his face. "Emma, you don't understand what you're offering to do. If you testify publicly, you become an even bigger target. Castellano will know exactly who you are, where to find you eventually." "I'm already a target," Emma interrupted him. "Jake, you just told me that Castellano has lawyers making public noise about you, that there's political pressure, that this is becoming a high-profile case. Do you think my identity as a witness will remain secret much longer, especially if the case goes to trial?" She had a valid point, and Jake clearly knew it from the way his jaw clenched. But Emma wasn't finished. "And if Castellano's lawyers try to use his actions, his breaches of protocol, his personal connection to me, anything to create reasonable doubt or undermine the case," Emma continued, her voice growing even more determined, "I will make sure that every person in that courtroom understands the full context. I will make sure that jury or judge or whoever is deciding understands that you are not a corrupt police officer operating outside the law for personal gain. You are a man who has seen the system fail before, who carries the guilt of that failure, and who has made a conscious choice not to let it happen again." Emma finally closed the distance between them completely, standing directly in front of Jake and forcing him to look directly at her as she made her next statement. "You said your biggest fear is losing me. Well, My biggest fear now is losing you not to physical danger, but to a system that will punish you for doing the right thing. And I'm not going to stand by and let that happen without fighting with everything I've got." There were tears in her eyes again, but they were tears of determination instead of fear or sadness. "So yes, I'll take the risk. I'll publicly expose myself as a witness, if it means protecting you the way you protected me. I'll face Castellano and his lawyers, and whatever consequences come, because Jake, you're worth it. You're worth every risk." Comment below. Now she's protecting him. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because Emma's statement, "you're worth every risk," marked a complete transformation in the dynamic of their relationship. And what happened in the following moments would reveal not only the emotional impact of those words on Jake, but also the hidden truth about what really happens when two people stop trying to protect each other and start facing danger together as true partners. Jake stood completely still for 3 seconds after Emma said that, and Emma saw something breaking behind his eyes. Not breaking in the sense of destruction, but in the sense of his last defensive barrier finally giving way. And then he crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and pulled Emma into a hug that was simultaneously desperate and relieved and laden with emotion that neither of them had fully verbalized until now. The hug wasn't gentle or careful. It was the hug of a man who had been holding his emotions under iron control and who had finally let that control slip. Jake pulled her against him with a force that would have been almost too much if Emma hadn't been holding back with equal intensity, both needing that physical contact to confirm the reality of being there together, facing all of this. Emma felt Jake's entire body trembling, slightly fine tremors that he probably thought he was hiding, but that she could feel perfectly. She felt his breath against her hair, uneven and deep, as if he were trying to control his emotions through sheer respiratory discipline. And she felt his accelerated heartbeat against her chest. "You're impossible," Jake murmured against her hair, and there was something in his voice that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Stubborn and impossible, and completely frustrating, and I don't know how to deal with you." Emma felt her own laughter bubbling up even through her tears. "I learned from the best," she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "You spend weeks being stubborn about protecting me without considering the consequences. And then you're surprised when I do the exact same thing." Jake pulled her even closer. "It's not the same. I'm trained to face danger. You are. What am I?" Emma interrupted him, tilting her head to look at his face. "Fragile. Incapable of making adult decisions. Jake, stop underestimating me. Stop thinking that only you can make sacrifices." She saw recognition of that in his eyes. "Emma, I don't want you to suffer the consequences of my choices. And I don't want you to suffer the consequences alone," Emma replied. "So maybe we need to stop trying to protect each other and start facing everything together." As true partners, they remained like that indefinitely, holding on to each other as if they could keep the outside world at bay through sheer willpower. And perhaps they could. Perhaps together they were strong enough to face anything: Castellano, investigations, legal consequences, the uncertain future. But then, Jake's phone rang, the sound cutting through that moment like a sharp knife. Emma felt Jake's body tense instantly, pulling away, but shifting from relaxed to alert in a split second. Jake picked up the phone, keeping an arm around Emma as he stared at the screen. His whole body stiffened even more, and when he looked at Emma, there was something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. "It's Captain Morrison," Jake said, his voice suddenly controlled and professional. "Calling at 9:15 at night. That's never good news. Morrison only calls outside of regular hours when there's a serious development." Jake answered automatically, putting the phone on speakerphone. "Mercer," he said, his voice now completely professional. "Jake." Captain Morrison's voice came through the line with audible tension. "Sorry to call you late, but this couldn't wait. We have a development in the investigation that needs to be addressed immediately." Emma felt Jake's free hand find hers. their fingers intertwining tightly in a way that revealed hidden nervousness. What kind of development? There was a pause that seemed like an eternity before Morrison spoke again. Victor Castellano filed a formal complaint this afternoon. He's alleging harassment, violation of rights, personal vendetta, and Jake, double quotes. Morrison hesitated. He mentioned a witness by name, Emma Carson specifically. He's arguing that you developed an improper relationship with a witness that compromises the entire integrity of the case. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because Morrison's statement, he specifically mentioned Emma Carson wasn't just a development in the investigation against Jake. It was a terrifying revelation that Castellano had identified exactly where to strike to inflict maximum damage, and that the hidden truth behind his entire strategy was to transform the very love that kept Emma and Jake fighting into a weapon that could destroy them both. And the impact of those words, the way they completely changed the terrain beneath their feet, would reveal just how vulnerable they truly were. Emma felt Jake's hand tighten on hers, almost painfully, as Morrison continued speaking through the speakerphone, his voice carrying the weight of news he clearly didn't want to be delivering. And Emma watched Jake's face grow progressively paler as he listened, saw muscles in his jaw tense until they were visible even in the soft kitchen light. The complaint is detailed, Morrison continued, and there was something like reluctance in his voice. Castellano's lawyers did their homework. They have specific dates when you were allegedly out of jurisdiction without authorization. They have records of departmental equipment usage, and Jake, they have photos. Emma saw Jake close his eyes briefly, as if the revelation had been a physical blow. What kind of photos? He asked, his voice hoarser than usual. You and Emma, Morrison said, and there was clear discomfort now. Going in and out of your house, buying groceries together. A photo through the window of you two. Jake, the photo shows you two, obviously close in a way that isn't strictly professional. They're arguing that you developed a romantic relationship with a witness under your protection, which constitutes a massive conflict of interest and potential coercion. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. They had been watched, photographed. Her privacy had been invaded in ways she hadn't even realized. And now those photos, moments that had been precious and private, were being turned into evidence against Jake. The bail hearing is tomorrow at 9 a.m, Morrison continued. And Jake, Castellano is requesting a restraining order, preventing you from any further involvement in the case. He's arguing that you pose a threat to his safety and to the justice of the process. That your actions demonstrate personal vendetta rather than proper law enforcement. Jake finally opened his eyes, and Emma saw resolve forming there, even through the obvious fear. And the witness? He asked. What specifically is he saying about Emma? There was a long pause on the other end, and when Morrison spoke again, there is something like pity in his voice. He's arguing that she's in more danger under his protection than she would be under proper official protection. He's telling the judge that he has serious concerns about the witness's safety given her emotional distress and protocol violations. He's essentially painting you as a corrupt police officer who put a witness at risk through unauthorized actions. Emma felt anger seeping through the fear. This is absurd, she said loudly enough for Morrison to hear through the speakerphone. Jake saved me. Multiple times. I would be dead if it weren't for him. I know, Emma, Morrison interrupted, and there was genuine kindness in his voice, and I believe that. But the problem is that Castellano's lawyers are very, very good at creating alternative narratives. They'll argue that you were coerced, that you developed Stockholm Syndrome, that your judgment is compromised by inappropriate relationships. The call lasted a few more minutes, Morrison explaining hearing procedures, detailing what Jake could and couldn't do in the next 24 hours, offering advice on lawyers should Jake decide to seek legal representation. But Emma barely registered the details, because her mind was racing through implications, through how skillfully Castellano had turned the situation against them. When Jake finally hung up, the kitchen fell into a heavy silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Emma looked at Jake and saw an expression she couldn't quite decipher. There was fear there, yes, but also something like resolution mixed with the pragmatic defeat of someone who had seen a move in a chess game and recognized that he was in a much more vulnerable position than he had realized. Castellano made a move, Jake finally said, looking at Emma with that complex mix of emotions. And it was a smart move. Brilliant, actually, from a strategic perspective. He identified exactly where to attack to inflict maximum damage. Emma shook her head, not fully understanding. But Jake, he's lying. Everything he's saying, it doesn't matter if he's lying, Jake interrupted her gently. What matters is if he can create enough doubt, and Emma, he can, easily. Because there's truth mixed with lies, and that's the most dangerous combination. Jake started pacing now, his nervous energy needing an outlet. It's true that I violated protocols. It's true that I used resources without authorization. It's true that I developed a personal relationship with you that goes beyond the professional. All of these things are true, documented, and can be proven. He turned to look at her. So when his lawyers mix these truths with allegations that I endangered you, or coerced you, or carried out a personal vendetta, Emma, they create a narrative that is convincing because it's anchored in real facts. And that narrative, if a jury or judge accepts it, undermines the entire case against Castellano. Emma felt the weight of that strategy finally sinking in completely. He's using your love for me against you, she said softly. He's turning the very thing that kept me alive into the very thing that could set him free. Exactly, Jake confirmed. And you're arguing that you're in more danger with me than you would be without me. Which is cruel irony because I know that official protection would have failed. But how do I prove that without admitting that I consciously violated protocols because I didn't trust the system? Comment below. This strategy is diabolical. And there was the impossible truth that Emma and Jake now faced, that the MO that had grown between them, that connection that had become more important than badges or careers or even personal safety, had been weaponized by clever lawyers into something that could destroy not only Jake but the entire case against Castellano. That every precious moment they had shared, every decision Jake had made to keep her alive, every sacrifice he had made without hesitation, would now be scrutinized and distorted and used to paint him as corrupt and her as a coerced victim. Emma looked at Jake really, seeing not only the sheriff who had risked everything, but the man who had finally, vulnerably, admitted that his greatest fear was losing her. And something solidified within her at that moment. A decision that went beyond simply witnessing or defending his character. Determination to fight with everything she had. Then let's go to the hearing tomorrow, Emma said, her voice firm despite trembling hands. Together, and let's make it perfectly clear that no amount of legal manipulation will change the facts that Castellano is a dangerous criminal, that you saved me when the system failed, and that any relationship we developed came after and because of that genuine act of protection. Jake began to protest, probably arguing that her presence at the hearing would only give Castellano's lawyers more ammunition, but Emma raised her hand. Partners, she said simply. Remember, we face everything together now. Not you protecting me or me protecting you, but us facing this side by side. That's what Castellano doesn't understand. He thinks he can use our love as a weakness. But in reality, it's our greatest strength. Jake pulled her into a hug again, and Emma felt him trembling against her, not from fear, but from overwhelming relief at no longer carrying everything alone, at finally having a true partner willing to stay, no matter how difficult it got. Sometimes, Jake murmured against her hair, the enemy attacks exactly where you're most vulnerable. And yes, Castellano found that vulnerable point. But what he doesn't realize is that he also found where we're strongest. Because Emma, you and I, together, we're much more resilient than he imagines. And as they stood there in the softly lit kitchen, with the audience that would change, everything waiting just 12 hours later, they both knew that the real battle was only beginning. But for the first time, they were facing each other completely honestly, completely committed to fighting side by side, completely certain that regardless of the outcome, victory that would set them free or defeat that would cost them everything, they would do it together. Because sometimes love isn't about one protecting the other. It's about both choosing to stay and fight, even when all logic tells them to run. Look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you feel this intensity of love that chooses to fight even when everything seems impossible, if you understand that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that are most worthwhile, then subscribing to this channel is the way to continue walking this path with me. Because Emma and Jake still have a lot ahead of them: the hearing tomorrow, the confrontation with Castellano's lawyers, and the discovery of whether their love can truly survive when tested by an entire system determined to destroy them. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I need to know if you're as invested as I am. If you felt every moment of this revelation, every layer of vulnerability that Jake finally showed, every impossible decision Emma had to make about risking everything to protect the man who risked everything for her. And if this touched you in any way, if you felt your heart clench when Castellano turned their love into a weapon, if you understood the weight of facing not only physical danger, but an entire system determined to punish you for doing the right thing, leave a like so I know. It's you telling me that these stories of love tested by impossible circumstances, of people choosing each other even when the whole world is against them, really matter. There's a video over here of her being kidnapped. The sheriff goes beyond legal limits to rescue her. Click and follow along with me there. The story doesn't end here. In fact, the most intense part is only just beginning. See you soon.